Professor Karen Turner from Temple University, who's a journalism professor and a former journalist herself. We have Emily Previti, who from the PA Post, who covers voting and elections in Harrisburg, and Halle Stockton from Pittsburgh's PublicSource, who's the managing editor. Let's see, and then moving on to Zoom logistics, just make sure to use the chat to ask questions, offer resources, offer ideas. This is meant to be more of an informal conversation, not like a webinar where we just have people talking at you, though we'll do a little bit of that at the beginning. Remember to mute when you're not talking. Try to keep responses brief so that other people can speak up. Andrew Rockway, the Senior Community Manager for the Trusted Elections Network, will be manning the chat. Again, feel free to use it for resources, questions, or offer additional commentary. And then, again, we've got a lot to cover. So even if we don't get to everything in this call, we'll collect whatever resources or questions you may have. We'll try to answer them elsewhere or combine them with unanswered questions from our Wisconsin conversation that can feed into more of what we're going to be doing in the future. So starting with why we're here, we basically have assembled, the Trusted Elections Network has assembled experts who represent a variety of disciplines, focuses, and viewpoints, but are all centered around trusted elections. The goal of the network is to connect journalists with those experts, to help them navigate the claims that researchers, practitioners, political actors, and others who deal in misinformation may have. And anything related to voting, electoral processes, and doing this all in support of audiences and communities. That means providing tools, strategies, and better practices for journalists reporting on these issues. Again, this is our second event related to states elections. We had one after the April primary in Wisconsin. We can post links to the Wisconsin reporting and lessons we took away from that, but that was a very fruitful conversation in analyzing things after the fact, and it provided us a lot of themes that we're going to be looking into going forward, which I hope will happen here. We also just released a resource guide last week, which might be of use to you. It deals in questions of election administration and misinformation. One of the things that we really try to do is take all the wealth of resources that exist out there and try to simplify them into something more cohesive and cogent for journalists to be able to actually digest and use. And so that resource guide is an assembly of a whole bunch of resources and information that we've gathered, or that primarily Andrew has gathered from the beginning, from the moment we started the network. So let's go ahead and move into the conversation. One of the main aims of the network is to support local journalists in informing the public about misinformation, disinformation, and all these issues related to voting. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists, starting with Jonathan in a moment, to a question or two that is pertinent to these topics, and they'll kind of talk a little bit about them. They were provided the questions ahead of time, so they'll kind of cover it more in presentation style. But with Jonathan, thank you for having us, or thank you for being here. So there was, I read through some of your reporting. One of the sources in an article you co-wrote with Julia, who unfortunately again couldn't be here, said that voting has costs, and these costs have been amplified in the wake of COVID-19. So I want to ask you, can you tell us more about these costs and how have they been amplified? Will the problem be solved by November?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that there are a couple of experts on the call, election experts, who can correct me if I get something wrong. So that's the good news here. No, the costs are not going to be fixed by November, because every single election, there are millions of dollars spent by various advocacy groups and nonprofit groups trying to fix the issue of turnout gaps, right? Whether we're talking about race, we're talking about income, we're talking about age, right? There are all these issues, and that's the problem of the cost of voting. How much is it a benefit to you, and how much does it cost? And so what we're talking about in a situation like that is, if you have shift work and you're working 2 different jobs and you have to give up an hour or 2 of pay in order to go vote at the polls, that is worth a lot more to you than maybe it is to a white collar worker who's salaried and can afford to just swing by after work, right? And that's like a literal cost, but we're also talking about cost of like time. We have to think about stuff like, what kind of polling place do you have available? That's especially true when we're talking about like voters with disabilities, right? And so when we talk about cost, it's very much like in the grand economic sense of like benefit cost analysis. What's your vote worth to you, and how much does it cost you to be able to vote? And the reality is, until we see turnout, we see the removal of these gaps, and we don't see unequal turnout across different groups. No, I mean, the costs are going to remain unequal, and they're not going to get fixed by November, but certainly many people are going to try.
So along those lines, we know a little bit about the costs. We know that that we could potentially respond, and one of the ways that you responded was one of your stories about the closure of polling places. It specifically had a way to find your own polling place embedded in the article, and you even called that out in the headline, which I think is super important and useful to think about, not just the story, but the action that you kind of want to get to at the end of the story. Do you think you'll keep doing those service journalism pieces alongside your other reporting? Are there other ways that you found that are useful to respond to the costs that have been burdening voters out there?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't even necessarily see them as a service journalism piece versus some other kind of journalism, right? I cover voting rights and elections. I don't write about it from a partisan perspective. I don't care about the politics of it necessarily. I am interested in who has access to vote, how do you vote, who actually uses that access, right? And so what we've done is, and if we have new polling places, we'll put a map and we'll say, here's how you find new polling places. When we talk about absentee ballot deadlines, we'll put in italics at the end of the story. We'll say, here's the absentee ballot deadline. Click here to request your ballot. Click here to track your ballot. We did this with a year or two ago. There was an issue where UCAVA voters were not given their, that's like overseas and military voters were not able to access the state's website. And what you had to do is you had to like email the state and you had to call the state. So what we did was we included that contact information at the top of the story, in the middle of the story, and at the bottom of the story. Because at the end of the day, the way we see the journalism is like, it's not helpful if we call something out if we don't fix some of these problems. And that's not a partisan stance, and that's not even service journalism. We just see that as like, that's the mission of this kind of beat covering elections and voting rights. And so, yeah, we're gonna continue doing that. Sometimes we do write specific stories that are like, here's how to register to vote. Here's how to request an absentee ballot. But the rest of the time, we'll really include it inside stories, but then we'll also call it out in ital, we'll call it out in a box, we'll let people know, if you've read our story, you should have a way to do whatever it is that you need to do off of that.
Thanks, Jonathan. But along those lines, and I think what Jonathan's getting at is, I think that's, it could only be as good as the people getting the information as far as the reporting goes. And so I'm going to turn to Professor Karen Turner to talk a little bit about that. Jonathan's reporting has indicated that low-income communities and communities of color in Pennsylvania are requesting far fewer absentee ballots. And I believe today is the deadline. So we also know from our work in Wisconsin and with talking to elections experts that mail-in voting is not a great equalizer necessarily. So Professor Turner, how can reporting reach these groups who stand to be disenfranchised by all the changes to voting? How can journalists respond to get communities of color the information they need to vote? Oh, you're muted, I believe.
Let me just thank you for putting this on, because I think that this is the kind of conversation that needs to take place, and needs to take place quite often, actually. As we know, the right to vote is the bedrock of our democracy, so getting clear and accurate information to voters is so very important. And in thinking about this, I looked at what was done in Wisconsin, read a lot about Wisconsin, watched your program in Wisconsin, and have been looking at just a lot of the reporting. Like you said, how the Inquirer has reported that communities of color have not been taking advantage of mail-in voting and that kind of thing. What was missing for me was why. Now, I've gone into looking at the voting for New Jersey. I'm a New Jersey resident, and I'm doing the I'm doing the application. I did the application. And I also looked in Pennsylvania. And let me just tell you, this is not easy, okay? If you've gone in there and you've looked. And so I've come up with my own reasons why probably some of these things are challenging for communities of color. And also, and it's not just limited to communities of color, it's anybody. There are a lot of issues, and it hasn't been made easy. If you don't have the technology, if you don't have a printer, I have printed out for a couple of people just applications and mailed them to them. If you don't have access to the internet, if you, and keep in mind, because of COVID, you had people who would use libraries. Libraries are closed, so you don't have that access route too. Also, municipal government buildings are closed, because I noticed that there were phone numbers for, if you had a question, call them, but those places are closed. And so I think it's important because there's so much noise out there. You have, because of COVID and the reporting about the pandemic, there's a lot of things that have been lost in terms of, I think, the election. And so to kind of get through the noise, I think the information just has to be presented in a way that is most interesting and easy, like Jonathan was talking about how they would put their information in the particular articles he was talking about. But I think I kind of came up with a list of things that I wanted to suggest to journalists. And the first thing is to engage policymakers to talk about the barriers that are preventing the communities of color and others, such as those in rural areas, from using the mail-in ballots. This is a time when it's so important, but there are like really, really crucial bottom line issues, and that discussion isn't taking place enough, and people need to know. I mean, as I mentioned before, internet access to printers, and postage. In Philadelphia, apparently, if you apply for a mail-in ballot, when you get your envelope, it is pre-postage paid. So that's really good, but that's not the case apparently for across the country. So what are our policymakers doing to resolve these issues? And of course, COVID-19 has exposed so many of these various disparities. Also, something I was looking for, excuse me, in the articles that I read are the voices of the people who are not able to participate in the mail-in process. So where do we find those people? Well, contact local churches, perhaps, as a place. Partner with churches. See if there are people in those various zip codes who you can have conversations with, so that people can hear firsthand those narratives for those people who are trying to figure out, okay, I have a phone, I don't have a computer, I don't have a printer, how do I get this information? Because I know that through churches and politicians, they have been trying to get the word out about the availability of the mail-in applications. So it's great to have this information, but if you can't actually access the process, it's a problem. Policymakers need to talk about what they are doing to resolve these issues, and that kind of reporting, I think, is very important. Contact churches to identify the congregants. Also, perhaps you can link critical articles like the one that Jonathan referred to on perhaps church websites. That might be another place where people can get information. Legacy journalists partnering with ethnic media. You have, especially radio in communities of color, are very important. So partner with them and maybe go on these shows, talk about what you are finding in terms of these various issues around voting. I mentioned, as I was thinking about this, back in the early 80s, when Harold Washington was being encouraged to run for mayor of Chicago. He was the first African American to eventually become mayor. And he challenged the community to increase the registration rolls. And along with the media and also activist groups in Chicago, they came up with a theme. It was called Come Alive October 5. October 5 was the deadline for voter registration. And it was a jingle, you heard it on the radio, you heard reports in the newspapers about this, and it really galvanized and informed the community about what was coming up. The need to constantly talk about why voting is important. We talk about voting. It's important to remind people, especially look at down ballot races. How are these people who are up for election, who are running for sheriff, for the school board, what have you, how do they impact your daily life? And I think COVID probably has given us an opportunity to kind of step back and really assess what our lives are really like and who are the politicians who really have an impact on our day-to-day living. So I think that's an opportunity there. Process timelines with deadlines. When and how to register to vote. How to apply for vote by mail ballot. What happens if your ballot doesn't come? I've thought about that. This is the first time I participated and sent in an application. I'm not quite sure I know what to do if my ballot doesn't come. When should I be concerned that I have not received my ballot? These are the kinds of questions that if people are going to participate in the process that way, they will have these types of questions. Mailing drop-off locations. And the articles must be evolving because early reporting talked about the fact that in New Jersey, the primary was the same day as Pennsylvania, which is next Tuesday. However, I found out today that it's not. It's been postponed until next month. When did that happen? Okay, but it's something that happened recently. I missed it, and I've been reading a lot about this. So these are things that constantly have to be appearing in legacy media, in social media, places like that.
Yeah.
Also, and I'm almost done, and just another place, just in terms of getting voices for people who are challenged, especially if we're talking about the mail-in ballot applications and the mail-in ballot process. Social media, someone may have a phone, they may not have a computer, but they may have a phone, and you can certainly reach people that way through Twitter, through Instagram, through Facebook. Just 3 more points. Due to the years of disenfranchisement, voters of color understandably aren't trusting of the system. So it's important that there are articles explaining what happens once the ballot is mailed. Are there postal service delivery issues? There are issues now just in general with the post office. What's going to happen, especially if we're talking about looking toward November? Are the counties prepared for the onslaught of requests and ballots? And getting interviews with those people, those county commissioners, to talk about what the process is like. Regarding in-person voting, there must be articles on the possibility of voter intimidation, the rights of voters at the polls. Also, between now and November, efforts of voter suppression. There are lawsuits out there. You've been writing about them. Voter purges. Got to keep on top of that. And just the last point: keep reporting and doing the follow-ups, because this is so fluid. Things are changing so quickly, and you have the pandemic that you are competing against. And this is so crucial, especially this year when we have a census. I mean, that's another angle in terms of the importance of reporting. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Professor Turner. Again, there was a wealth of information and a good overview of all the things that we're going to be dealing with or confronting. But as you said, this is not just affecting communities of color, it's communities across Pennsylvania. And so I wanted to talk a little bit to Emily Previti from the PA Post about that angle. So basically, you did write a story recently with Katie Meyer of WHYY about how voters are getting conflicting information on where to go to vote on June 2nd. So what are the areas of the state, especially areas outside of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, where changes brought on by new election administration rules are having an effect, and the changes brought on by coronavirus are creating issues? And will those issues persist into November?
I mean, I would say that pretty much every county is struggling to some extent to deal with administering an election in this environment. For that particular story, when we were focused on communicating polling place changes to voters, we learned that Westmoreland and Carbon counties, for example, just didn't have the bandwidth or they chose not to update the polling place changes because the changes were temporary and then they'd have to change it back or something. And we had a handful of counties, including Mercer and Cambria and Berks, that were still in the process of updating the SURE system. So that feeds into the Department of State locator that you can call up on their website. All of these counties that I just mentioned and many more are doing direct notification of voters by mail, which the temporary rules in response to the pandemic don't require them to, but they are, and or posting new location information at the old polling place in the event that voters show up there. So Lehigh County was one that had just finished. So that would indicate that these elections offices were pretty well stretched. And there are other indicators besides this as far as counties struggling. I'm working on an update as far as what the status is with personal protective equipment at the polls for both voters and poll workers. And most counties haven't received anything yet from the Department of State. Some of them think they'll have enough without it, some don't. So there are a lot of challenges that they're facing.
And it sounds like the legislature is making some attempts to get data about this. Does it look like they're going to get that data? Will it be useful before November, or we assume, what is that data going to say about absentee ballots, mail-in ballots, and other issues related to voting?
So you mentioned some of the key points that the report would hit. The reason for the bill is presumably to ensure that lawmakers would have this information to rely on if they need or want to make more changes to the election code that would be effective for the general election. To the extent that it can be passed the House of Representatives almost unanimously with just one person voting against it, Mike Carroll from Lackawanna and Luzerne County, I believe, and he did that because he said he wasn't sure to what extent it would add to the workload of county election directors and simply couldn't get that answer before the vote was taken. So it seems like it probably would pass. And as for whether it would make a difference, it just depends on the nature of the change. The bill calls for the report to be out 2 months after the election, or the primary rather, that's 3 months ahead of the general. So, to that extent, yeah, I think that it would be in time, for example, if they wanted to move a deadline or something like that. But it also kind of depends on other factors like whether the legislature would actually move in response to the report that comes out, and federal funding, how much more of that's available, things along those lines.
Thank you, Emily. And so I want to tie this all together from a newsroom leader perspective. And so I'll turn it over to Halle Stockton from PublicSource. And basically, we've heard from Jonathan about some of the challenges and some of the issues, from Professor Karen Turner about how communities of color and other communities might respond to this, and from Emily about the legislative issues and the bipartisan approach that Pennsylvania has taken in the past. And you at PublicSource have talked to experts in some of your reporting before. So how is that chat with experts informed how you're fulfilling kind of your public service mission? And are there any big questions that you think that we need to be asking ahead of time, especially ahead of November?
Absolutely. Probably more big questions than I might alone can cover here. But, you know, referring to this article that we put out where we consulted with 7 different experts on voting, particularly voting security. We asked them a handful, maybe a little bit more than that, questions about this need to shift to mail-in voting because of the pandemic in a state where it's an untested system. This was already going to be our trial run, so it's just being stressed hugely now. And what we wanted to do here, as we were we've incorporated forms where readers can send in questions, concerns, whatever they're thinking, and we're getting a whole gamut of responses, some that are more quality than others, and we're basically recording those. This is not a new concept. It's you know, obviously we're trying to invite our readers into, you know, letting us know what's keeping them up at night. And elections is really, it's one of those things, whether people are actually planning to vote or not, there are still a lot of people who are invested in the outcome. So we're getting a lot of questions and concerns, and we decided we wanted to try to get around, although this is impossible, the politicization of everything, and try to find these credible experts, and several of them, so that we could get a really broad spectrum of views. And we even, with this particular article, we decided on a format that is very close to Q&A fashion, and we chose that to basically send a strong signal to readers that this is undistilled. We're not trying to weave a narrative or an agenda or anything here. We're trying to just give you this information in the most straightforward way. So those were all intentional choices to get through to people and to be very responsive to these questions. I think one of the big questions for us, you know, our most extensive elections reporting leading up to pandemic times has been around the counties being required to purchase voting systems with a voter verified paper trail. This was the result of the lawsuit by Green Party candidate Jill Stein, and there were several counties that were required to find these new systems. In Allegheny County alone, it's a $20 million expense. So it was a big deal, and something that was, you know, the talk of the town in the fall and summer leading up to the fall. And so we did a lot of reporting on that. It was a big expense. Some state assistance is there for that, but now we have all these new, fairly unexpected expenses brought on by the pandemic, and amid this testing of an untested mail-in voting system. So I think one of the biggest questions that journalists across our state and probably most others is what the financial fallout will be, and not just those numbers, but how will that affect people? How will that affect taxpayers? Will that mean that our county needs to pull dollars from other local programs to support the elections, which are obviously very important, but will that impact people who are trying to get other types of assistance that are locally based? So those are matters that we'd really like to explore, that we think it's very fertile ground and an important ground to cover.
Great, thank you, Halle. And there was one question I was going to ask you, but I think I kind of want to open up to the group. So if anyone can chime in on chat, including you, Halle, that'd be helpful. How do you communicate uncertainty around this time? It sounds like one way that Halle's that the people at PublicSource did that was by kind of having an unfiltered conversation with these experts. But if there's any other suggestions or any way to like communicate with the community, especially around things that are constantly shifting, I would love to hear more about it. But now I'm going to shift it over to Tammy Patrick from Democracy Fund, who's a former elections official and a elections advisor currently. And we're gonna talk about a little bit about what we've maybe missed here. How should election results be communicated as they come in? What kind of questions journalists should be asking, and what are the timeline for changes? So she's going to share some slides with us. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm going to share my screen here. And it's one of those things where I like a good picture and I like to elevate some of your work as well. So I put together a small slide presentation because one of the things that I think is really important is to take a look at some of the big pictures in this instance. And I always say that, you know, every election has a story to tell, and sometimes we don't know what that story is going to be until long after the ballots are counted. We don't have to look far back to 2016 to know that the story can change after the fact when we know more details. And so as we go into this November and also the election that's coming up in just a few days, really thinking about how this is really all very different than anyone would have expected. The other piece to this is that, let me get the slides advancing here, is that really to think about how important it is the words that are being used, because voters are listening. And we already have seen where there's some questioning by many leaders on the integrity of our electoral process, no matter whether it's voting in person or voting by mail. So we want to make sure that the word selections that we're making are very purposeful. And that also comes to the experts that we're relying upon in the stories. So I always turn to one of my favorite reporters, and that's Pam Fessler. And I talked to her about covering elections and said, what do you recommend to new reporters on the elections beat? And she just says to talk to as many people as possible, because that really is one of the most informative things you can do, and making sure that you are talking to both state and local election officials. And if you cover the whole state or multiple states, talking to them in various areas, because you can get very different stories. And one of the things that she also has highlighted is really being aware of your market. Part of the challenge in this ecosystem of mis and disinformation and changing information is that we want to make sure that the correct information is out there for voters when they're trying to make their decisions on how they're going to effectively participate. And when markets overlap, that can be a real challenge. We also know that what do voters want and what engages them in the process? So the Center for Civic Design did this great study a while back, and they found that it's not the case that a voter thinks, okay, I need to register to vote, and then I need to, get prepared to vote. The very first thing a voter says is, do I even care? If they care about the election, then they want to know what's on the ballot, what are their options in voting, what do they need to do or bring, do they need ID if they're going to go and vote, and then lastly, are they registered to vote? The reason I bring this piece up here is that when we're covering elections, we know that we want our communities to be engaged in the process. We want it to be reflective of their voices. So in that fact, we need to make sure that they're registered. So covering all of the various ways in which people can register is really important. And those of you on the call, many of you have covered elections for a long time, and you understand the complexities of the story that can be told, and that it's so much more really than a horse race. So I wanted to provide some ideas of where you can get content, where you can get B-roll, where you can get information about the elections being held either in your state or across the state without even having to travel. The first thing I would say is make sure you're following all the social media accounts in your state, because that's a great way to get content. It's also important to get and make sure you're on every media press list and get any media packets that they're putting out. But knowing, of course, that things can evolve. But many of the larger jurisdictions will do behind the scenes media tours, and this is a really great time to get B-roll, to get images of, you know, the workers with their COVID masks on, and really puts a face, because those people on the news are your neighbors, they're your friends and your family, on what exactly is happening. Covering some of the functions of local officials, like logic and accuracy testing, can also answer some of those questions that the professor had of, you know, things like, well, what happens with the ballots when they come back? What happens with these machines? Do they even get tested? So answering some of the questions that will help to allay some of those fears. And then lastly, on election day, many election offices have command centers. This one is in Chicago. In Chicago actually has it set up that media can see the reporting system of all the issues that are coming in. They have open access to it. So it really gives you real-time reporting of what's happening out in the polls. And then the last piece of this, and this ties also into that confidence, is covering any of the post-election audits that occur. So risk-limiting audits are kind of a newer thing in election administration, and so many places are doing them now. And it's a great way to cover all of the work that goes into making sure that only eligible voters participated in the election, making sure that the correct winner was in fact the one that was chosen. I like to include this picture because this is Alice. I worked with Alice for about a decade in Maricopa County, Arizona. And this picture was taken in 2012. I'm probably off frame a little bit. I see this picture every election cycle. Whenever anybody Googles provisional ballot, they pull this picture down. It's important to have that relationship with your state and local officials. So you're highlighting what's happening in your jurisdiction, in your state, in your hometown, so that people see, oh yeah, that looks like the ballot box that I see when I go to the polling place. So it's just important to get that right shot. It is not helpful to show voting systems and voting equipment that's not being used in your state. I liken this to knowing what's right is as important as reporting what's right, but also it helps you in identifying when something is wrong. So if you get a tip that it's a video and it's saying that the voting system isn't working properly and it shows you a video and it's not a piece of equipment used in your state, that's good for you to know quickly. So there's an advantage to that. I think that, that they were absolutely spot on that resources is going to be one of the stories in 2020 on what exactly are people having to make do with and without. I love this picture. This is St. Louis County, Missouri. Those are racks of voting equipment, of which cost thousands and thousands of dollars, and they didn't have enough money to buy carts, so they made them out of PVC. People are going to have to be resourceful in this time of COVID. There was a question in the chat around language assistance and having translated materials. There are also those public interest stories around poll workers, which can have rich narratives of individuals who served you know, the community for years and years. And it also highlights what is available for individuals that need that language assistance, which is something that everyone has available to them in many, many jurisdictions. In Pennsylvania, there are 3 covered counties for Spanish. And so that's important to be able to highlight that, and there was some discussion of it. One of the other things I wanted to mention, because we've talked a lot about voting, and I know we're after the registration deadline for June, but looking towards November, it's important to know that many states have taken advances in their policies to modernize voter registration with automatic voter registration, online voter registration, joining ERIC. And so Pennsylvania's done 2 of those things. Having these policies in place will help the states in this COVID moment, because it's a presidential election cycle. We don't have third-party groups and candidates and election officials at the farmer's market, at the state fair, in front of the library, registering voters. So it's important that we look at some of those policies, because we know from research that 40% of Americans don't know they have to update their voter registration when they move. We know that for many of them, if they have online voter registration in their state, 1 in 4 voters said that they didn't when they did have it. Half the voters who said they didn't know actually have it available to them. So I loved the fact when you're talking about service journalism, including the links, including the information, so that voters can help to be educated in that moment. The one thing I will say is we can't make any assumptions about how any voting cohort is going to behave in this moment. We saw that in Wisconsin when they've had very few people vote by mail in the past, and they had almost 1.5 million people. In this moment, people are going to have to make choices about remaining safe and remaining healthy. And for many of them, it's not going to be going to a polling place to vote in person. It's going to be voting by mail. And so knowing what their options are, it's going to be really, really critical. And those options are changing both through legislative practice, through administrative decisions, as well as litigation. So it's a lot to keep on top of. And we know that particularly in Pennsylvania, there have been a lot of changes. For someone who didn't vote in 2019 in a local race, there's going to have a lot of changes for them. Voting in person has changed. We have the consolidation of some of the polling places for November. We don't exactly know what November is going to look like, but we know that everyone's going to need to be prepared because polling places will definitely be different with consolidations. Many of the facilities are already saying you can't use our church, you can't use our lobby, you can't use our facility for November, and that's going to create some challenges for a lot of voters. And for tens of millions of voters, we know that they have their ballot handed to them by the Postal Service, not a poll worker. So the real story here, when we talk about vote by mail, of which I could go on forever about, are the deadlines. It's important to think about the fact that the Postal Service recommends voters put their ballot in the mail a week before the due date. A week before. So Tuesday before Tuesday's election is when you should be putting the ballot in the mail if you're going to mail it back. So states that allow you to request a ballot before that time, after that time, it's really too late for the voter to be successful. And there are a couple of resources out there. I'm going to cover a few of them, but provide the slide deck with the rest of them for later. There's this report that I did in 2016 that goes kind of through the new reality of voting by mail. And the highlights here to talk to our legislators and our policymakers about is the application process. Do you have to do it for each election? Can it be a year annual? Is it a permanent list? Talking about the envelope requirements. Part of why the envelope and trying to figure out where to sign is so complicated is because of statutory requirements. Whether or not ballot tracking is available. Many places have ballot tracking. You get a text message to say your ballot came back, there were no issues. Checking those dates and deadlines, making sure ballot return options, whether you can use a drop box or not, knowing whether or not a postmark is available, and then really talking about the security of voting by mail. And I like to refer to the absentee voting by mail, vote at home process as really flattening the curve. We need timely requests. So if a voter waits until the last day to request that ballot and it's Friday before Tuesday's election, it may not get there by Tuesday because we have, mailing deadlines and that sort of thing. So knowing and covering the story of today's the first day you can request your ballot by mail. Don't wait, do it now. And I do think that looking at the administrative process, this is from Montgomery County over the weekend, this is why it takes a while. These are individuals who are opening up absentee ballots. Across the country, a lot of this is being done by someone folding up a ballot, putting it in an envelope, hand addressing it, and putting it in the mail, which is fine if they have a few dozen. It's much more difficult when they have thousands, if not tens of thousands. And voting by mail can take a little while longer if the voters don't return the ballots until late in the game. And so Jonathan, here's another one of your highlights here. It's time to get comfortable with the idea the races can't be called or shouldn't be recalled or won't be called immediately on election night because those are definitely unofficial results. So there's a common saying among election officials that elections are fast, cheap, or accurate, but you only get to pick two. And we know everyone wants them cheap. So the question is, what is going to be the tension point for the rest of it? I think that post-election reporting about provisional ballots and counting of the early ballots that have come in are really, really important so that voters know that their ballots are not just thrown out or thrown away. And that's where it gets really important. So what stories to watch? Security and voter confidence. It's an interesting point for election officials. They're used to being pretty transparent, and here there are things they maybe can't talk about, but that's certainly going to be something to watch. Accessibility is going to be a huge thing to keep an eye on. What's going to happen with voters with disability in this COVID era if we have fewer in-person voting options, which we most likely will because we can't get enough facilities to let people in. What will happen with voters in care facilities, nursing homes, hospitals, etc. Also, there's going to be a lot of litigation and legal intervention, so keep an eye on that. And misinformation. We already know that the challenges to creating this kind of chaotic approach to it is one of the important pieces. So my last slide, or last two slides, electionline.org, if you're not familiar with it, is a daily news source of reporting on election administration. It has national reporting, and then also it's divided up by state. And so many of you who are reporters, if you weren't aware of it, your work is probably being disseminated on Election Line every day to additionally thousands of people. But it's a great way to see what other people are reporting about, even in your state and across state lines, and to get that kind of general overview. So with that, there's some other slides on other resources that I will send along so everyone has those available to them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tammy, for that great presentation. I wanted to, yeah, there was a wealth of information. Again, we'll share these resources after the fact, as Andrew mentioned in the chat. I like one point that Vanessa made about saying that voters are confused because if their communities aren't being served the information that they need, then it's probably the wrong language to be using. And on that note, if Vanessa's able to join in, there was a question from Maylee. Oh, like, what do you suggest for news orgs looking to connect with, gain trust, and then effectively serve the critical election info needs of community segments whom they don't yet have relationships with? Vanessa chimed in with some things that Philly Camp's doing, and I wanted to give her an opportunity to kind of speak to that and see if there's any lessons we can take away from that.
Well, the easiest thing to do is to hire people of color, younger people, people who are from lower income communities, you know, to be journalists or contributors in your newsroom. We know, you know, the Pew Research put out a pretty important report talking about who the non-voters are, right? They tend to be younger people under the age of 35 with lower income from communities of color. If those are the people that you really want to, you know, reach with voting information and information, giving them compelling reasons to vote, then you need to have those people as part of your staff and in your newsroom. Being that we're community media, this is built into our model of media making, right? We have a youth radio program, and they've been doing stories about election and getting ready to vote and paying attention to elections. And so again, it's one thing for me as an older person to be talking to youth about that. I don't think that would resonate very far, but having youth do that and in the proper platform too, right? You know, we sort of trick them into doing radio by telling them it's an Instagram live show in the radio studio. But, you know, we have to put those messages on TikTok, on Snapchat, on Instagram if we want to reach younger people. You want to reach the Latino community, you have to put information in Spanish. You want to reach people that aren't very literate, then you have to have other forms of media. So, you know, even now as a radio station, we've had to move a lot of production online and make a lot more videos because people are sharing videos on WhatsApp and in Facebook Messenger, especially the Latinx community. So that means if we want to reach them, we have to change our content into other platforms, even though we're a radio station. So people need to be able to sort of shift their message to the proper platform for the communities that they want to meet. And then also just, you know, maybe if you are not in a position to hire people, how can you train and work with people who are part of an advisory council or can serve as regular guest contributors or guest writers to also be sharing the information? So we try to work a lot with our nonprofit partners, faith-based leaders, community organizers, and activist groups to include them in these discussions. People in that group that I talked about, they don't want to hear from academics and policy experts or old white people. They want to hear from people like them who are from the community that are going to speak in a way that they understand. And so I think also, you know, providing information in a language and a format that people can easily absorb and, more importantly, repeat to other people. So if I read something and I get it, then I can share that with a neighbor or a friend and tell them how to do it. So I think infographics and graphics that are shared on platforms like Instagram are also really important. Not everyone's in a position to do all these things. We have a lot of volunteers that we're working with to help us. So, you know, think about one or two of those things that you might be able to do and scale it up. We've been doing this for 10 years now. So, you know, we have learned a lot of lessons during that time. But I also think that people are so desperate to tell their stories and be heard and be represented that they volunteer. You know, I manage over 80 volunteers on our community radio station. That tells me that people are available and out there who want to share public information. So I think that a lot of newsrooms don't really capitalize on the use of community members as volunteers, as interns, as people that can advise them and be part of the reporting process. Because, you know, they know and they trust people that they listen to regularly. And those are the people that they're going to take advice from. And those are the people's stories they're going to share. So if they see people that they follow that are popular, that are sharing these stories, they're going to share it as well. And I find that people are more likely to share from our producers than to share from our source, you know, so like WPPM, FM platforms or pages don't get as many shares as the producers do when they share the information themselves. Yeah. So that's what I would recommend.
Thanks, Vanessa. That's great. I mean, that really speaks to me as my mom's a respiratory therapist, super smart person. She's looking to vote for the first time, but it's easier said than done. So that really speaks to me. I think Halle also, Halle also mentioned some first-person narratives that PublicSource has done in the past, but that can definitely be a source of conversation as far as engaging with the community. I do want to make sure that we touch on one quick thing before we have to wrap up here. Unfortunately, the hour went by really quickly. The political nature of all of this. So whether that be Emily or Halle or Jonathan. So a lot of the changes that happened in Pennsylvania came because of bipartisan changes. That may or may not persist in the long run, especially if things continue to get more partisan. Is there a way to prepare audiences for what will be a contentious election cycle that'll have accusations of voter fraud or rigged elections? Is Pennsylvania any more immune to that, or are you guys facing that same thing, and what are you doing in response?
I mean, I think we are not immune. If anything, we're the battleground state that a lot of people are going to be watching. And we are a state that has dense urban areas and also very rural red areas, right? And that plays out in Harrisburg, and we have gerrymandering and all these different things. When it comes to the partisan nature of it, I think one of the problems has been the two sides just don't even want to talk to each other sometimes. And it can be very difficult if you're not a political reporter. Like, I'm not a political reporter. It can be hard to tell what's real and what's not. And so, you know, for me, it's like a matter of staying out of the politics. When it comes to something like, hey, can you accept election results or something? I did a story a few months ago. There's this concept that Ned Foley at Ohio State identified called the blue shift, where absentee ballots, provisional ballots, these ballots that are counted after election day often tend to lean Democratic. And so what happens is the vote that you see on election night might swing after, you know, when you're counting the actual results afterward, the certified results. And knowing that this was going to happen, knowing that we've already seen claims, you know, false claims about election rigging in other states, my editors and I decided, like, this is maybe a wonky academic topic, but we need to write a story now so that when something happens in November, we can point back to it and say, no. Experts told you long ago that this could happen, and here's why, and here's how it works. And if we can call out that kind of thing in advance, that allows us afterward, it gives us some credibility afterward to say, seriously, it's not fraud, here's why.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to that for just a minute or so before we have to wrap up? All right, no worries. So again, basically the lesson I take away is the importance of preparing. Preparing, as Joy said, it's important to point out what was predictable, known, and researched ahead of time. We're convening these conversations with the Trusted Elections Network in order to make sure that we take time to do this. I think collaboration will be a useful aspect in all of this. There is definitely opportunities out there to kind of engage with this material. As Kevin pointed out, Harkin is running an election SOS training that might be useful for some of you. If you were interested in joining our listserv, because we hold these sort of events and engage in these sort of conversations, you can email election2020@pressinstitute.org, or we'll include the form to sign up in the chat comments if you want to do that. Again, we'll be doing this again for potentially other states, or at least different themes related to this. We do have that listserv where we have experts and journalists kind of trading resources and tips and questions, which is, again, useful if you want to engage with it. And then if you want stuff to look forward to from our network will be, we have that resource guide, which I already mentioned. Again, we'll have additional events going forward, especially touching on topics of misinformation and voting on mail are things that we're looking at. We'll send out the recording of this conversation. We'll send out Tammy's slides, and any takeaways from the conversation, we'll try to write those up for you and include them in future material. Again, I want to thank all of our guests. I want to thank Vanessa for her additional input. I want to thank Professor Turner and Tammy for her slides, and all the reporters that join us. Again, there's a lot to work on here. But we look forward to engaging with you in the future and hopefully continuing this conversation way past the time. Thanks again, folks.
Thank you.